The orchard in the southeast corner of Pike County, Missouri, had been underwater for 11 months by the time anyone got around to listing it for sale. The real estate notice in the Bowling Green Times described it as 2 acres of flood-damaged fruit ground and assigned it a starting bid of $15. Not $1,500. Not $15,000. $15. The cost of a decent lunch, which was more or less what every farmer in the county thought the land was worth. Nobody bid on it. Nobody even drove out to look at it, except one person, and she was 16 years old, and she drove a 1994 Dodge Dakota with a busted passenger mirror and a notebook on the seat beside her. Her name was Della Parch. She had been watching that corner parcel for 3 years. Most people who watch stories like this scroll past without ever subscribing. But if you've ever been counted out before you even opened your mouth, if you've ever walked into a room and felt every set of eyes slide past you like you weren't there, stay with us. Subscribe. This one is for you. The land itself was the first thing you had to understand. Before Della, before the listing, before the 11 months underwater, that southeast corner had been a working apple and pear orchard for about 40 years, put in by a man named Elvin Couch, who had died in 1997 and left no will and 4 children who did not agree on anything. The trees were mostly Red Delicious and Bartlett, nothing exotic, nothing that would win a prize at the state fair. But Elvin had planted them on a low shelf of ground that dropped about 6 feet over a quarter mile toward a creek called Cuivre Branche, which fed the Cuivre River, which had a habit, every several years, of deciding the whole shelf of ground looked like a better place for water than for trees. The flood of 2019 had been worse than most. The shelf went under in March and did not come back until the following February. When it drained, what was left looked like what happens when you leave something in a glass of water too long. The bark on the lower trunks had gone gray and soft. The grass was silt and straw. 3 of the older pear trees had split at the crotch. A man named Gerald Poff, who farmed row crops on the adjacent ground and had watched the whole thing, told his wife over supper that the orchard was good and done, and that whoever owned it should take the insurance and move on. Gerald was not a mean man. He was not wrong the way people are wrong when they're being lazy. He had farmed that county for 31 years, and he knew flood damage when he saw it. He also did not know what Della Parch knew. Della's grandfather, Raymond Parch, had kept a small orchard of his own, 11 trees, in Rawls County, about 40 minutes north. He had run it the same way for decades. No sprays he couldn't pronounce. No fertilizer that came in a bag with a number on it, and an absolute refusal to let anyone rush the trees. Raymond had died in the spring of Della's 14th year, and the week before he died, he had given her 3 things: a dekalb seed corn hat she still wore, a hand-drawn map of his property showing where each tree's root system ran, and a lesson she had not asked for, but had written down anyway. He told her about something called anaerobic root stress. He had learned about it the hard way, in the flood of 1982, when 20 feet of Cuivre Branche water had sat on his backlot for 6 weeks and taken 3 of his Jonagold trees completely. Not the trees he expected to lose. The ones he thought would make it didn't, and 2 that he'd written off came back. He spent the next 2 winters reading everything the University of Missouri Extension Office had put out on flood-stressed stone fruit and pome fruit. And what he came to understand was this: the survival of a flooded fruit tree had almost nothing to do with how long the water sat. It had to do with when in the season the water came, what the soil composition was below the rootstock, and whether the crown, the point where the roots branched off the trunk, had been above water during the critical recovery window in late summer. Trees that drowned in early spring, before bud break, before the vascular system was fully active, had a substantially better chance than trees that flooded in July. The Quiver Branch flood of 2019 had crested in early March. Raymond had made her write that down. He also told her something about silt. Flood silt, he said, was not the enemy that people assumed. Silty clay deposits from a slow-moving flood carried phosphorus and trace minerals that opened soil up in ways that no bag of 1010 could replicate. You had to let it dry correctly. You had to not run machinery over it before the structure set. But if you left it alone, if you did not rush it, it was closer to a gift than a disaster. He had seen it. He had numbers in his ledger to prove it. Yield per tree in the 3 years after the 1982 flood had been higher, not lower, than the 3 years before. Della had the ledger. Raymond had given it to her along with the notebook. She did not share this with anyone in Pike County when she drove out to the flooded orchard that February of 2020. She walked the rows alone. She carried a soil probe she had borrowed from the Rawls County Extension Office, and she took samples at 8 locations, which she sent to a private lab in Quincy, Illinois, because the university turnaround was 6 weeks, and she needed the results in 10 days. The lab cost her $280, which was most of what she had saved from weekend work at the grain elevator in Frankfurt. She also carried a measuring pole, and at each tree she noted the crown elevation and compared it against the February waterline still visible as a pale ring on the bark. 22 of the 31 surviving trees had crowns that had cleared the waterline by at least 3 inches. 14 of those 22 showed active bud nodes on this year's wood. Gray-green. Tight, swollen at the tip. The kind of node that a flooded tree that had given up would not show. She wrote all of it down. A man named Harlan Siebert was at the auction. He had been running fruit ground in Lincoln County for about 20 years and had been asked by the Couch heir's attorney to have a look at the parcel and give an informal opinion on value. Harlan walked the rows the same morning Della did, about 2 hours ahead of her. He spent maybe 15 minutes, noted the bark damage and the split pears, and told the attorney the ground was fit for row crops once the stumps were cleared, if somebody wanted to put the money in. He bid $8 at the auction, just to have something on record for the attorney. He did not think anyone else would show up. Della showed up with $47 in cash, and her lab results folded in the front pocket of her coat. The auctioneer that day was a man named Bob Teasley, who had been running farm auctions in Pike County since 1984, and who later said he had seen everything, but had not seen this. There were 11 people present. Most of them were there because farm auctions in Pike County were a form of social gathering as much as a commercial transaction, and the weather had been decent. Harlan Siebert opened at $8. Della said 15. Nobody moved for a moment. Harlan looked at her, not unkindly, just the way a grown man looks at a child who has said something that requires a small recalibration. He said 20. She said 30. He looked at the attorney. The attorney looked at his phone. Harlan was not going to bid against a teenager for flood-damaged apple trees over $50. He had done stranger things, but not many, and not in public. He shrugged. He let it go. Bob Teasley called it at 30. Then he paused, because 30 was what the girl had offered and nobody had countered. He looked around the small crowd once. Nobody moved. He brought his gavel down and said sold the way auctioneers do when they're not entirely sure what they've just sold. Della paid with cash and a personal check for the remainder, which she had co-signed by her father, who was present and who had not said a word for the duration of the auction, because they had made an agreement before they drove down that this was her thing, and he was only there to sign if she needed the signature. The soil report came back from Quincy 10 days later. It confirmed what Raymond's ledger had suggested. The silt deposit had elevated available phosphorus to nearly twice what the baseline soil survey showed from the previous decade. The pH had come up slightly, 6.4 from 6.1, which was actually better for apples. The rootstock below the damaged trees was viable at depth. The lab's agronomist had included a note at the bottom of the report that said, in plain language, that whoever owned this ground was likely to see strong recovery in year 2 and 3 if the trees were managed correctly. Della did not rush anything. She did not run machinery in the spring. She cleared the 3 split pear trees by hand with a chainsaw she borrowed from Gerald Poff's neighbor, a man named Leon Whitaker, who had been in Pike County his whole life and who would later become something of a regular presence on the orchard's fence line, watching. She pruned the water sprouts on the surviving trees in the way Raymond's notebook described. She soil tested the following fall. She applied a modest foliar calcium spray in August of the first year, which was the one input Raymond had trusted for post-flood recovery, and which cost her $60 at the co-op. In year 2, 20 of the 22 viable trees produced fruit. The yield was not a record. It was not a headline. But for 2 acres of ground that every man at that auction had written off as silted-out junk put 6,400 pounds of apples and pears across the Pike County farmers market, and 2 small grocery accounts by the end of September, at an average farm gate price of about 62 cents a pound. The math worked out to just under $3,970, which was not a fortune, but was $3,970 more than $30 of condemned flood ground was supposed to produce, and everyone who had been at the auction did that math on their own. Gerald Poff was the first one to ask her about it directly. He stopped her in the farm supply in Bowling Green in October and said he had watched those trees and didn't think they were coming back and wanted to know what she had seen that he hadn't. She told him about the crown elevations. She told him about the bud nodes in February. He listened without interrupting, which was not a thing he did easily, and when she was done, he said he wished he'd known Raymond Partch. She said most people who hadn't known how much he knew. She is 19 now. She has added the adjacent 3 acres and put in a block of Honeycrisp and a small block of Calmus, pear-on rootstock she selected herself from a nursery in Geneva, New York. She sells to a regional grocery distributor out of Hannibal and has a waiting list for U-Pick on fall weekends. She has started keeping her own notebook. The ledger Raymond gave her sits in the farmhouse at the edge of the orchard. She doesn't need to read it anymore. Most of what's in it she can recite from memory. But she keeps it there because, she said this once to her father, and not to anyone else as far as he knows, she keeps it there because when she's unsure about something, she likes to hold it. Not open it. Just hold it. Raymond Partch never saw that orchard. He died before the first flood, before the listing, before the $30 auction, before any of it. But every row of it came out of that ledger, and every apple in it came out of what he took the trouble to write down for a 14-year-old girl who he believed was paying attention. She was. The things that get written down are the things that last.